A descent into the Maelstrom. They said no ship that enters the Maelstrom ever comes back. But I was inside it, a living ocean vortex, a mile wide, pulling everything into absolute darkness. And in the middle of it, I realized something terrifying. The sea wasn't killing everything instantly. It was deciding what to keep alive and what to erase. There are stories that don't feel like stories. They feel like warnings. Tonight, you're about to enter one of the most terrifying accounts ever told at sea. A journey into a whirlpool so powerful it swallows ships and bends reality itself. This is not just a tale of survival. It is a descent into the unknown, where fear turns into observation and death feels closer with every second. A fisherman, a storm, and an ocean that decides who lives and who disappears forever. Now, listen carefully, because once this begins, there's no turning back. They had now reached the summit of the highest crag. For a few moments, the old man said nothing. His breath was heavy, worn down by the climb, as if even standing still required effort. At last, he spoke. "Not long ago," he said, "I could guide you along this path as easily as the youngest of my sons." A pause. "But 3 years ago, something happened to me." His voice lowered. "An event such as no mortal man has ever endured, or at least none has lived to describe it." He looked away as if the memory itself was too heavy to face directly. Those 6 hours of terror changed everything. A longer silence followed. "Since then, I have never been the same," he continued slowly. "You may think me an old man, but I am not. I was not always like this before that day. My hair was jet black. My strength was whole. My mind steady." Another pause. Then, in less than a single day, everything changed. He lifted a trembling hand. "See these hairs? They turned white. My limbs weakened. My nerves failed me." A faint shiver ran through him. "Now I tremble at the slightest effort, and I'm frightened even by shadows." He looked down over the cliff edge. "And do you know," he whispered, "I can scarcely look over this ledge without feeling dizzy." The little cliff upon which the old man had so carelessly thrown himself to rest was anything but little. He lay there with most of his body hanging over the edge, supported only by his elbow pressed against a narrow, slippery ledge. Beneath that fragile point of contact, the rock dropped away into a sheer, uninterrupted precipice of black, shining stone. It fell straight down for 15 or 1600 feet into the jagged world of crags far below. From where I stood, nothing in existence could have tempted me within even a few yards of that brink. The sight alone was enough to freeze thought. So overwhelming was the danger of my companion's position that I collapsed fully to the ground. I clutched at the sparse shrubs around me as if they alone held me to the earth. I could not bring myself to look upward, not even toward the sky. In my mind, everything seemed unstable. Even the very foundations of the mountain felt as though they might be torn loose by the violence of the wind. I remained there, motionless, struggling against my own fear. It took a long time before I could force my thoughts back into order, before I could even sit up, and longer still before I could gather enough courage to look out again into the vast distance before us. "You must get over these fancies," said the guide, "for I have brought you here so you may have the best possible view of the scene I mentioned and hear the whole account with the place itself directly beneath your eye. We are now," he continued in his precise, matter-of-fact tone, "close upon the Norwegian coast. in the 68th degree of latitude, in the province of Nordland, and within the bleak district of Lofoten. He paused, then added, "The mountain on which we sit is called Helseggen the Cloudy. Now raise yourself a little higher. Hold to the grass if you feel dizzy. Yes, like that. And look outward, beyond the band of mist beneath us, into the sea." I obeyed him, but the moment I looked down, a wave of dizziness struck me. Below us stretched an immense ocean, its surface so dark, so ink black, that immediately brought to mind the ancient accounts of the Mar Tenebrarum, a sea of utter desolation. No human imagination could have formed a scene more hopeless, more lifeless. To the right and left, as far as vision could reach, ran long chains of cliffs like the world's final walls, black, towering, and violently jagged. Their gloom was intensified by the surf below, which threw itself upward against them in white, violent bursts, rising high, then collapsing back with endless, screaming force. The sound was constant, a perpetual howl, a shriek that never ceased. Directly opposite the mountain peak where we stood, and several miles out at sea, a small island could be seen, not clearly, but through the chaos of waves that surrounded it like a moving veil. It appeared bleak, lifeless, almost lost within the storm of water around it. Closer to the mainland, perhaps 2 miles out, another island rose, smaller still, more savage in appearance. Its surface was nothing but harsh rock and barren cliffs, and around it, scattered at irregular distances, lay clusters of dark, broken stones rising out of the sea, like remnants of something long destroyed. The appearance of the ocean, in the space between the more distant island and the shore, carried something distinctly unnatural about it. At that moment, a heavy gale was blowing directly toward land. So strong was the wind that a brig far out in the open sea was forced to run under a double-reefed trysail, her hull constantly plunging beneath the surface as she fought the storm. And yet, in this nearest stretch of water, there was no true swell, no long rolling motion. Instead, the sea moved in a strange, broken agitation, short, sharp, furious bursts of water striking in every direction, not only against the wind, but against itself. It was as though the ocean had lost all sense of order and rhythm. Foam appeared only near the rocks, where the waves broke violently and immediately vanished into spray. The old man continued, still pointing outward. "The island in the distance," he said, "is called Verg by the Norwegians. That one midway is Moskoe. Farther north, that small point is Ambaren." Then he gestured slowly across the horizon. "Those scattered ones are Eilsen, Hotholm, Kildholm, Swarven, and Buckholm." His hand moved again, slightly farther out. "And beyond between Moscow and Verglai, Otterholm, Flemmen, Sandfelsen, and Stockholm." He paused, almost dismissively. "These are their true names, though why anyone ever found it necessary to name them at all is more than either you or I can understand." Then suddenly his tone sharpened. "Do you hear anything? Do you see any change in the water?" We had now been about 10 minutes on the summit of Helseggen, which we had reached by a difficult ascent from the interior of Lofoten. From that height, we had seen nothing of the sea until it suddenly revealed itself beneath us. As the old man spoke, a new sound began to reach my ears. At first faint, then steadily growing louder. It resembled the deep, continuous moaning of an immense herd of buffaloes moving across an American prairie. At the same time, I noticed a striking change in the ocean below. What had earlier been described as a chopping and broken agitation was transforming, rapidly, It was becoming a single, unified current, and that current was moving eastward. Even as I watched, its motion intensified. Every passing moment seemed to feed its speed, its force, its uncontrollable urgency. Within 5 minutes, the entire sea visible toward Verg had been thrown into violent disorder. But the true center of disturbance lay between Moscow and the mainland. There, the ocean ceased to behave like water at all. The vast body of the sea appeared to fracture into countless intersecting channels, each one twisting, colliding, and cutting through the others without pattern or restraint. Then, without warning, the entire region erupted into chaotic motion, a furious upheaval. The water heaved upward, boiled, hissed, and twisted into immense rotating structures, gigantic whirlpools forming and collapsing in all directions. Everything was drawn into motion toward the east, spinning, plunging, racing with a speed no ordinary water could ever possess except in the most extreme descent or catastrophic fall. In a few minutes more, another dramatic change swept over the scene. The surface of the sea, once violently broken, began to smooth gradually at first, then with increasing clarity. One by one, the whirlpools vanished, but in their place, new patterns emerged. Long, immense streaks of foam appeared across the water where none had existed before, at first scattered, then multiplying, then stretching farther and farther across the sea. These streaks began to merge and interact, their motion slowly organizing itself into a familiar but terrifying pattern, the same rotational force that had defined the earlier vortices. Only now it was growing into something far greater, something forming, something assembling itself. Then abruptly, without warning, it happened. The structure completed itself. A perfect circle emerged upon the ocean's surface, more than a mile in diameter. Its boundary was marked by a wide ring of brilliant flashing spray, but none of that spray entered the center. Inside the circle was something entirely different, a vast spiraling funnel. The interior was visible only in part, but what could be seen was striking. A smooth, shining wall of water, jet black in color, slanting downward toward the horizon at an angle of roughly 45 degrees. It rotated with terrifying speed, not just turning, but swaying, twisting, and collapsing inward upon itself in a continuous motion of descent. From its depths came a sound that filled the air completely, a vast, overwhelming voice of the sea itself, part shriek, part roar, a sound so powerful and violent that even the greatest cataract known to man, Niagara itself, would seem silent in comparison. It was not merely noise. It was the ocean expressing pure, uncontrolled force, as if the water itself had become alive with rage and motion. The mountain itself trembled down to its very base, and the rock beneath us seemed to shudder as if it were alive. I threw myself flat upon my face and clung desperately to the thin patches of grass, overwhelmed by sheer nervous terror. After a moment, I found my voice. "This," I said to the old man, "this can be nothing other than the great whirlpool, the Maelstrom." "So it is sometimes called," he replied calmly. "We Norwegians know it as the Moskoe-ström, named after the island of Moscow, which lies within its reach." The old descriptions I had once read of this vortex now felt utterly useless. They had not prepared me in any way for what I was witnessing. One account in particular, attributed to Jonas Remus, perhaps the most detailed ever written, failed completely to capture even a fraction of the reality before me. It offered no true sense of the scale, the violence, or the overwhelming strangeness of the scene. No written description could convey the magnitude of what lay in sight, nor the sense of confusion it produced in the mind of the observer, as if perception itself struggled to interpret what it was seeing. I could not even determine from what position the writer had viewed it, or under what conditions, for it was clear that it could not have been from the summit of Helseggen, nor during a storm of this magnitude. There were, however, certain portions of his account that could still be mentioned, though they now felt distant and adequate, offering only faint outlines of a reality far more vast, far more terrifying, and far more incomprehensible than anything language could fully contain. Between Lofoten and Moscow, he said, the water is about 36 to 40 fathoms deep, but on the other side, toward Verg, the depth becomes so shallow that a ship can barely pass without striking the rocks, even in the calmest weather. When the tide rises, he continued, the current rushes inland between Lofoten and Moscow with violent speed. But when it falls, the return toward the sea is even more dreadful. The roar of that ebbing current is unlike anything else on earth, surpassing even the loudest cataracts. It can be heard for leagues, and the whirlpools, or pits as we call them, are so vast and deep that any vessel drawn into their reach is inevitably swallowed, dragged down to the bottom, and smashed against the rocks below. When the water relaxes, fragments of wreckage are thrown back up again. But these moments of calm exist only at the turning points of tide, between ebb and flood, and last no more than a quarter of an hour. After that, the violence returns, gradually building again. When the current is at its strongest, and especially when a storm feeds it, becomes dangerous to approach within a Norway mile. Boats, yachts, and full-size ships have all been lost for failing to respect its reach. Whales are often caught as well, he added, and when they are drawn into it, their struggles are beyond description. Their howls and bellowing can be heard from shore. A bear once tried to swim from Lofoten to Moscow, he said, but was taken by the current and dragged under, his roaring clearly audible on land. Even large trees are swallowed, he continued. Firs and pines are drawn down, then thrown back up, shattered and splintered, as though bristles had grown upon them. This shows, he concluded, that the bottom is made of jagged rock where everything is ground to pieces. The motion of this stream is governed by the tide itself, rising and falling every 6 hours. And in the year 1645, early on Sexagesima Sunday, it became so violent that even the stones of coastal houses were shaken loose and fell to the ground. In regard to the depth of the water, I could not see how such measurements could have been made in the immediate vicinity of the vortex. The 40 fathoms must, I concluded, refer only to the outer portions of the channel near the shores of Moscow or Lofoten. But the depth at the very center of the Moskoe-ström must be beyond calculation, immeasurably greater, and no clearer proof was needed than the sight itself. From the highest point of Helseggen, where even a sidelong glance into the whirl revealed an abyss of unimaginable scale. Looking down upon that roaring chasm, that living, howling void beneath me, I could not help but smile at the simplicity with which Jonas Ramus recorded certain details as doubtful, such as the accounts of whales and bears being drawn into it. For to me, the truth seemed obvious, self-evident, that the largest ship of the line, no matter its strength or construction, would, if it once entered that fatal sphere of influence, resist it no more than a feather resists a hurricane. It would vanish completely, instantly. The various attempts to explain the phenomenon, some of which I had previously found plausible, now appeared entirely different in the face of what I was witnessing. The most widely accepted explanation is this: that the maelstrom, like other smaller vortices among the Faroe Islands, is caused by the collision of tidal currents rising and falling against submerged ridges of rock and reef. These obstructions force the water into compression, causing it to rush downward like a waterfall. And as the incoming tide rises higher, the resulting fall becomes even more violent. From this interaction, a whirlpool is formed, its suction powerful enough to be demonstrated even by smaller experiments. This explanation is cited in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Others, such as Kircher and certain earlier writers, propose a more extraordinary theory: that at the center of the channel lies an immense abyss penetrating deep into the earth itself, possibly opening out again in some distant region of the globe, the Gulf of Bothnia being suggested in one instance, a notion dramatic, but scientifically baseless. As I stood watching, however, my imagination found itself strangely drawn toward this very idea. And when I mentioned it to my guide, I was surprised by his response. He said that although this belief is widely held among Norwegians, it is not his own. Regarding the first explanation, he admitted he could not fully understand it, and I found myself in agreement. For however logical such theories may appear on paper, here, in the presence of the abyss itself, beneath the thunder of the maelstrom, they lose all clarity and begin to feel almost meaningless. "You have had a good look at the whirl now," said the old man, "and if you will creep round this crag so that you are sheltered from it, and the roar of the water is lessened, I will tell you a story that will prove I know something of the Moskoe-ström." I did as he instructed, taking position where the rock broke the force of the wind and muffled the terrible sound below. Once I was settled, he began. "Myself and my two brothers once owned a schooner-rigged smack of about 70 tons, he said, and we used to fish among the islands beyond Moscow nearly as far as Verb. In those violent currents, there is often good fishing at the right time, if a man has the courage to risk it." He paused briefly. "But among all the men of the Lofoten coast, only we three made it our regular practice to go out that far. Most fishermen stay in the southern grounds. The waters there are safer, easier. Fish can be taken at almost any hour without much danger, and so the timid prefer them. But the grounds here among these rocks are different. The fish are finer in variety and far more abundant. In a single day, we often caught what other fishermen could not gather in an entire week." His voice hardened slightly, but it was never simple work. It became a kind of dangerous trade, a gamble where life itself replaced labor, and courage served as capital. We kept the smack in a small cove about 5 miles farther up the coast than this, he continued, and in fine weather, we would take advantage of the brief 15 minutes of slack water to cross the main channel of the Moskoe-ström well above the central whirlpool. After crossing, we would drop anchor near Otterholm or Sandfelsen, where the currents are less violent than elsewhere. There, we would remain until it was time for the next slack tide, and then weigh anchor again and return home. He spoke with calm precision, as if describing a routine, not a risk. "We never set out unless there was a steady side wind," he added, "one that would carry us out and bring us back again. And in most cases, we judged it correctly. Only twice in 6 years were we forced to remain overnight at anchor due to a dead calm, which is rare in these waters." He paused briefly, And once, we were forced to stay nearly a week. Starving, a sudden storm came in just after we arrived, and the channel became far too violent to attempt. He shook his head slightly at the memory. On that occasion, we would have been driven out to sea regardless of our efforts. The whirlpools caught us and spun us violently in place until, at last, we fouled our anchor and began to drag. It was only by chance that we drifted into one of the many shifting cross currents, those that appear one day and vanish the next, that we were carried under the lee of Flimen. And there, by pure fortune, we managed to secure ourselves. I could not begin to tell you even a 20th part of the difficulties we met with on those fishing grounds, he continued. It is a dangerous place even in the best weather, but we always managed to run the gauntlet of the Moskoe-ström itself without disaster, though there were moments when my heart would rise into my throat if we were even a minute too early or too late for the slack water. He paused, remembering. Sometimes the wind was weaker than expected when we set out, and then we would make less progress than we needed, while the current made the smack almost impossible to control. My eldest brother had a son 18 years of age. I had two strong boys of my own. They would have been a great help at such times, handling the sweeps and assisting in the fishing afterward. But despite the risk we took ourselves, we never had the heart to bring the young ones into that danger. He looked down quietly, for in truth, it was a dreadful danger. That is the plain fact of it. It is now nearly 3 years since what I am about to tell you took place. It was the 10th day of July, 18, a day that people in this region will never forget. For on that day, there came the most terrible hurricane ever known in these waters, one that seemed to come straight out of the heavens themselves. And yet, throughout the morning, and even well into the afternoon, there had been nothing unusual. A light, steady breeze blew from the southwest. The sun shone clearly. So calm was the weather that even the oldest sailor among us could not have imagined what was about to follow. The three of us, my two brothers and I, had crossed over to the islands around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he continued. We had almost filled the smack with fish, and we all remarked that the catch that day was greater than anything we had ever seen before. It was about 7 o'clock by my watch when we weighed anchor and began our return home. Our intention was to reach the worst part of the Strom exactly at slack water, which we knew would occur at 8. We set off with a fresh wind on our starboard quarter, he said, and for a time we moved along at a fine pace. There was no sense of danger at all. None of us suspected anything was wrong. We could see no reason for concern. Then suddenly, we were taken aback by a wind blowing from over Helseggen. That was highly unusual. In all our experience, nothing like it had ever happened before. I began to feel uneasy, though I could not say exactly why. We turned the boat into the wind, he continued, but we could make no progress against the eddies. I was just about to suggest we return to our anchorage when I looked astern, and there I saw the entire horizon covered with a strange copper-colored cloud, rising at incredible speed. In the meantime, he said, the wind that had checked us suddenly died away, and we were left completely becalmed, drifting helplessly in every direction. But this calm did not last long enough for reflection. In less than a minute, the storm struck. In less than 2, the entire sky was covered, and with the driving spray, it became so dark so quickly that we could no longer see one another aboard the smack. Such a hurricane has then struck us, he said. It is almost useless to attempt describing. No seaman in Norway, no matter how old, had ever experienced anything like it. We had already let our sails go by the run, he continued. But the moment the storm hit us properly, both masts snapped as though they had been cleanly sawed through. The mainmast went overboard, carrying my youngest brother with it. He had lashed himself to it for safety. Our boat, he said, was as light as anything that ever floated on water. It had a flush deck with only a small hatch near the bow, and it had always been our habit to batten that hatch tightly whenever we crossed the Ström as protection against the heavy chopping seas. That precaution saved our lives, for otherwise we would have sunk immediately. At one moment, we were completely buried beneath the water. How my elder brother survived, I cannot say. I never had a chance to find out. As for myself, he continued, the moment I let the foresail run free, I threw myself flat on the deck. My feet braced against the narrow gunwale at the bow. My hands locked onto an iron ring bolt near the base of the foremast. It was pure instinct. I was too overwhelmed to think, and yet it was the exact thing that saved me. For several moments, we were completely submerged, he said. I held my breath and clung to the bolt with all my strength. When I could no longer endure it, I raised myself onto my knees, still holding on, and managed to bring my head above water. Then the boat gave a violent shake, like a dog shaking itself after coming out of a river. In doing so, she threw off much of the water that had filled her. I was trying to recover my senses, trying to understand what to do next, when suddenly I felt someone seize my arm. It was my elder brother. My heart filled with relief. I had believed he was lost overboard, but in the very next instant, that relief turned into pure horror, for he leaned in close to my ear and screamed only one word, Moskoe-ström. No one will ever truly know what I felt at that moment, he said. I shook from head to foot, as though I had been seized by a violent fever. I understood perfectly what that single word meant. I understood exactly what my brother was trying to tell me, with the wind now driving us forward. We were heading straight into the whirl of the Ström, and nothing could save us. When crossing the Ström channel under normal conditions, he continued, we always kept far above the whirl, even in the calmest weather. And even then, we had to wait carefully for the slack tide before attempting the passage. But now, we were being driven directly toward the center of it. In a hurricane like this, at first, I tried to tell myself there was still a chance, that we might arrive exactly at slack water, that there was still a small hope. But in the very next moment, I cursed myself for even allowing such a thought. I knew the truth. We were lost. Even if we had been 10 times the strength of a 70-gun ship, it would not have mattered. By this time, he said, the first violence of the storm had passed, or perhaps we had simply become numb to it. As we raced forward before the wind, the sea changed again. The waves, once held down by the gale, now rose up in full force. No longer flattened, but towering, mountains of water. And then a strange change came over the sky. In every direction around us, the heavens remained black as ink. But directly overhead, a circular opening appeared in the clouds. A perfect ring of clear sky, deep, bright blue, utterly still. And through it, the full moon broke through. She shone with a brilliance I had never seen before, lighting the entire scene with absolute clarity. But what she revealed, he said quietly, was a sight I will never forget, and one I pray I never see again. I tried again and again to speak to my brother, he said, but I could not make him hear a single word. The noise around us had grown so overwhelming, so violent, that even my screams seemed to disappear into it. I shouted into his ear with all my strength, but there was no response. Then suddenly he shook his head. He was pale as death itself, and he raised one finger toward me, as if to say, "Listen." At first, he continued, I did not understand what he meant, but then a terrible realization struck me. I pulled my watch from my pocket. It had stopped. I looked at its face in the moonlight, and in that moment, I broke down completely. I threw it far into the sea. It had stopped at 7 o'clock. We had already passed the time of slack water, and the Moskoe-ström was at full strength. When a boat is properly built and well trimmed, he said, and not heavily loaded, the waves in a strong wind seem to pass beneath her. To a landsman, it looks almost impossible, but sailors call it riding the seas, and so far, we had been riding them well. But then, he continued, a massive wave struck us directly under the stern. It lifted us up with it, higher, higher, as though we were being carried into the sky itself. I never believed a wave could rise so high, and then we fell. A sudden drop, a violent sweep downward, a plunge so sharp it felt like falling from a mountain and dream. It left me dizzy, sick, disoriented. But while we were lifted up on that wave, he said, I caught a single glimpse of the sea ahead, and in that instant, I understood everything. The Moskoe-ström was directly in front of us, only a quarter of a mile away, but it no longer looked like the Whirlpool I had known. It did not resemble anything familiar at all. It was something else entirely, something beyond comparison. If I had not already known where we were, he said quietly, I would not have recognized it, but I did know. And in that moment, I closed my eyes, not from the spray, but from pure horror. My eyelids locked shut, as if seized by a spasm. It could not have been more than 2 minutes later, he said, when suddenly the waves beneath us vanished. At once, we were swallowed by foam. The boat spun sharply to larboard, then shot forward in its new direction like a thunderbolt. And at that same instant, the roar of the ocean disappeared beneath another sound entirely, a high, piercing shriek. It was like the combined scream of thousands upon thousands of steam vessels releasing their pressure all at once. We had entered the belt of surf that forever surrounds the Whirlpool, and I believed, without question, that the next instant would hurl us straight into the abyss. The descent itself could barely be seen because we were moving with such terrifying speed. The strange thing was, he continued, the boat no longer seemed to float in the water at all. She skimmed across the surface, light as an air bubble. On our starboard side lay the whirl itself, and on the larboard side rose the vast ocean we had left behind. It towered beside us like a gigantic twisting wall of water, separating us from the horizon. It may sound strange, he said after a pause, but once we were truly inside the jaws of the gulf, I became calmer than before. While we had only been approaching it, fear had almost destroyed me. But now, there was no longer any room for hope. And strangely enough, once hope disappeared, much of the terror disappeared with it. He lowered his voice. I believe it was despair itself that finally steadied my nerves. It may sound like boasting, he said softly, but every word of it is true. As death drew closer, I began to think less about my own life and more about the terrible magnificence of what surrounded me. In that moment, it suddenly seemed foolish almost shameful, to care so much about my own survival while witnessing such an overwhelming display of God's power. I remember feeling embarrassed by my fear, as though the greatness of the scene itself had humbled me. After some time, he continued, a strange curiosity took hold of me. I became fascinated by the whirlpool. Truly fascinated. I found myself wanting to see its depths, to uncover its secrets, even if it cost me my life. And strangely enough, my greatest sorrow was no longer the thought of dying. It was the thought that I would never return to shore, never tell another soul what I had seen. He paused for a moment. No doubt these were strange thoughts for a man facing death. And afterward, I often wondered whether the endless spinning of the boat around the vortex had begun to affect my mind. Perhaps I had become slightly delirious. But there was another reason my terror began to fade. The wind had vanished, or rather, it could no longer reach us where we were. As you saw yourself, he said, the belt of surf surrounding the whirlpool was far below the ordinary level of the sea. And now the ocean rose above us like a gigantic black mountain, towering on every side. If you have never been caught at sea during a true gale, he continued, then you cannot imagine what the wind and spray together do to a man. They blind you. They deafen you. They choke the breath from your lungs. And worst of all, they rob you of the ability to think. But now, deep within the gulf, we had been freed from much of that torment. And the strange piece of it reminded me, he said quietly, of condemned prisoners receiving small comforts only after their sentence has become certain. How many times we circled the whirlpool, he said, I could never say. We spun around it endlessly, perhaps for an hour, but it felt like an eternity. We were no longer floating, we were flying, round and round, drawn closer and closer toward the terrible inner edge of the abyss. All that time, he continued, I never once released my grip on the ring bolt. My brother remained at the stern. He was clinging to a small empty water cask, the only object on deck that had not been swept away when the storm first struck us. It had been tightly fastened beneath the counter, but as we neared the brink of the vortex, his terror overcame him. He let go of the cask and lunged toward the ring bolt. It was too small for both of us to hold safely, and in his panic, he tried to force my hands away. The old man lowered his eyes. I have never felt sorrow deeper than I did in that moment. Not anger, sorrow, because I knew my brother had lost his reason. He was no longer thinking clearly. The fear had driven him mad. I did not fight him for the bolt. What would have been the point? We were all doomed already. So I released my grip and made my way toward the cask at the stern. Surprisingly, it was not difficult. The boat still moved with a strange steadiness. She spun rapidly, but remained balanced, swaying only with the enormous surges and rolling motions of the whirlpool. I had barely secured myself to the cask when suddenly the boat lurched violently to starboard, and then we plunged straight into the abyss. I whispered a desperate prayer to God and believed everything was finished. As the boat dropped, he said, I tightened my grip around the barrel and shut my eyes. For several seconds, I could not force them open. I waited for the end. I expected at any moment to feel the water crush the life out of me, but the seconds passed and I was still alive. The sensation of falling slowly faded, and strangely enough, the motion of the boat did not feel very different from before, except now, she leaned much farther along the slope. At last, I gathered enough courage and opened my eyes once more to look upon the scene around me. I will never forget what I felt when I opened my eyes, he said quietly. Awe, horror, and something very close to admiration. All at once, the boat seemed suspended by magic, hanging halfway down the inside of an enormous funnel, a funnel so vast, so impossibly deep, that the mind could scarcely comprehend it. The walls of the abyss were perfectly smooth, smooth as polished ebony, and yet they spun around us with such impossible speed that the eyes could barely follow them. The moonlight poured down from the opening in the clouds above, that strange circular rift in the sky, and its golden light streamed along the black walls of the vortex, far, far down into the deepest reaches of the abyss below. The entire pit glowed with the dreadful radiance, beautiful but monstrous. At first, he continued, I was too overwhelmed to notice details. The terror and magnificence of the sight consumed every thought, but gradually, my senses returned, and then my eyes drifted downward. Because of the angle at which the boat hung upon the slope of the whirlpool, I could see directly into its depths. Our vessel remained perfectly level. The deck beneath us was steady, but the water itself slanted downward at a terrifying angle, more than 45 degrees, so that it felt as though we were lying almost on our side. And yet, he said with disbelief still lingering in his voice, I found it strangely easy to keep my footing. I could still stand. I could still hold on, almost as if we were sailing upon calm water. I believe, he said after a pause, it was because of the tremendous speed at which we revolved. The motion was so swift, so constant, that it held us in place. The moonlight reached deep into the abyss, he said, as though it were trying to uncover the very bottom of the gulf. But even then, nothing below could be seen clearly. A thick mist covered everything, a boiling cloud of vapor and spray, and hanging above that mist, there was a rainbow, a vast and terrible rainbow. It stretched across the mouth of the abyss like some trembling bridge between worlds. And it reminded me, he said quietly, of the old Mussulman legend. The bridge suspended between time and eternity. The mist itself, he continued, must have been caused by the crushing together of those immense walls of water deep below. But the sound rising from beneath it, he paused, that scream, I would not dare attempt to describe it. Our first plunge from the ring of foam above had carried us far down the slope of the vortex. But after that, our descent became slower, not steady, never steady. We circled endlessly, in sudden swings and violent jerks. Sometimes we covered only a short distance. Other times we spun almost entirely around the whirlpool in a single sweep. With every revolution, we sank lower, slowly, but unmistakably. As I looked across that immense black ocean turning around us, he said, I realized we were not alone inside the vortex. Fragments of shattered ships drifted everywhere, massive beams of timber, broken tree trunks, barrels, furniture, pieces of crates and wreckage, all spinning with us toward the same doom. And by then, he admitted, the strange curiosity inside me had grown even stronger. The closer death came, the more fascinated I became. I began studying the objects around us, watching them, comparing them. I must have been half delirious, he said with a faint, humorless laugh, for I actually found myself entertained by it. I started guessing which object would disappear into the abyss first. I remember looking at a floating fir tree and thinking, that one will surely plunge under next. But then, to my surprise, the wreck of a Dutch merchant ship spun past it and vanished first. Again and again, my guesses proved wrong. And after a while, that fact itself began to terrify me, because I realized there was a pattern hidden in the chaos, a law, something governing the descent of every object around us. And the moment I understood that, my limbs began trembling once more, and my heart began to pound with fear again. The trembling that seized me then, he said, did not come from fear alone. It came from something far more dangerous. Hope. Underscore a strange, desperate hope. One born partly from memory and partly from what I was seeing with my own eyes. I remembered, he continued, how the shores of Lofoten were often covered with wreckage thrown back out by the Moskoe-ström. Pieces of ships, timber, barrels, fragments from countless disasters. Most of them were horribly mangled, splintered, roughened as though they had been torn apart by giant teeth. But not all of them. Some pieces returned untouched, perfectly smooth, almost unharmed, and suddenly I realized there had to be a reason for it. I began to think that the shattered fragments were the ones dragged deepest into the vortex, the ones that had reached the bottom before the tide shifted, while the untouched pieces, perhaps they had entered later or descended more slowly, so slowly that the current reversed before they could reach the depths. And if that happened, they might be carried back upward without ever being destroyed. That thought changed everything. Underscore, from that moment, he said, I began observing the objects around me carefully, studying the way they moved, the way they sank, and little by little, I noticed patterns. The first thing I realized was that larger objects descended faster than smaller ones. The second, that round objects disappeared more quickly than objects of other shapes. And the third, he paused. The most important observation of all was that cylindrical objects sank the slowest. Long after my escape, he continued, I spoke about these things with an old schoolmaster in the district. He explained the principles to me. He used words like sphere and cylinder. I barely remember the explanation now, but he confirmed what I had already discovered with my own eyes. A cylinder floating inside a vortex, he said quietly, resists the pull better than almost any other shape. It is drawn downward more slowly, and once I understood that, I realized there might still be a way to survive. One thing in particular convinced me that my observations were correct, he said, and it filled me with desperate determination. With every revolution around the vortex, we passed floating objects, barrels, masts, broken yards from wrecked ships, and many of the things that had once been level with us were now far above us, still circling, but descending much more slowly. In that moment, he said, I finally understood what I had to do. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. Underscore, I decided to tie myself securely to the empty water cask, to cut it loose from the boat, and throw myself into the sea with it. I tried to warn my brother. I shouted to him, made signs, pointed toward the floating barrels around us. I did everything I could to make him understand my plan. Underscore, for a moment, I believed he understood. But whether he truly did or not, he only shook his head, slowly, hopelessly, and refused to leave the ring bowl. Underscore. I could not reach him, and there was no time left. The whirlpool was dragging us deeper with every second. So with the heaviest sorrow I have ever known, I abandoned him to his fate. Underscore. I fastened myself tightly to the cask using the same ropes that had secured it to the stern. And then, without allowing myself another moment to think, I hurled myself into the sea. The barrel carried me exactly as I had hoped. I survived. And because I stand before you now, telling this tale with my own lips, you already know that somehow I escaped the monstrous grip of the whirlpool. There is little left to explain, only the ending of the nightmare itself. It may have been an hour after I cast myself from the doomed boat, perhaps longer. Time had lost all meaning inside that living abyss. Far beneath me, I watched the smack, our poor fishing vessel, continue its terrible descent. It spun wildly 3 or 4 times in rapid succession, like a leaf caught in the hand of a furious giant. Then, carrying my beloved brother with it, the boat plunged straight downward into the roaring chaos of foam below, and vanished forever. I never saw him again. The barrel to which I had bound myself drifted much more slowly. Before I descended even halfway into the gulf, something extraordinary began to happen. The whirlpool was weakening. The vast black walls of water slowly lost their terrifying steepness. The violent spinning grew weaker with every passing moment. The roaring softened. The gigantic funnel that had seemed eager to swallow the whole world now began to relax its grip upon the sea. Little by little, the white froth disappeared. Even the ghostly rainbow hanging above the abyss faded into the mist. Then I realized something impossible. The bottom of the gulf was rising, or perhaps the sea itself was calming. Above me, the clouds had broken apart. The hurricane had passed. The moon shone once more in cold silver light across the dark waters. At last, I emerged back upon the surface of the ocean. The shores of Lofoten stood before me once again, and beneath me, the terrible Moskoe-ström, that monstrous pit of death, had vanished as though it had never existed. The sea still rolled in mountainous waves left behind by the storm, but the fury was gone. I drifted helplessly through the current until fishermen found me near the fishing grounds along the coast. They pulled me aboard their boat. I was alive. But I was no longer the same man. Exhausted beyond words, trembling from terror and shock, I could not even speak. The horror of what I had witnessed still crushed the breath within my chest. The men who rescued me were my own companions, men I had known for years. Yet they stared at me as if I were a ghost risen from the grave. They did not recognize me. The day before, my hair had been black as midnight. Now it was completely white. Even my face, they said, had changed. I told them everything, the storm, the whirlpool, my brother, the abyss beneath the sea, but they laughed. None of them believed me, and now I tell the story to you. Though I suspect you will place no more faith in my words than did the merry fishermen of Lofoten, the ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not as our ways. Nor are the models that we frame anyway commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of his works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus.